Good day. Today is Monday, 7th July 2025, and there are certain time constraints, unfortunately, affecting today's video, so it may be somewhat shorter than my usual videos, but anyway, we shall see. Firstly, I'm going to return to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And I say that because over the last couple of hours, the Russians have again set out clearly their diplomatic position, their position with respect to a conclusion of the war, and they have provided that information in the form of an interview which Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has given to the Hungarian media. And TASS, the official Russian news agency, TASS has provided us with a detailed summary of the interview. First of all, it quotes Lavrov saying this: on the agenda are the goals of Ukraine's demilitarization and denazification, the lifting of anti-Russian sanctions, the withdrawal of all lawsuits against Russia, and the return of its assets that were illegally seized in the West. All these provisions should be spelled out in a legally binding peace agreement. And then we're told we do not need a pause that the Kiev regime and its external handlers would like to take to regroup troops, continue mobilization, and strengthen military capabilities. First of all, it is necessary to eliminate threats to Russia's security in connection with the expansion of NATO and Ukraine's involvement in that military bloc. A sustainable settlement is impossible without eliminating the root causes of the conflict. It is no less important to make sure that there is respect for human rights and the territories remain under the control of the Kiev regime, which after 2014 has been exterminating everything associated with Russia, Russians, and Russian-speaking people. The Russian language, culture, traditionals, canonical orthodoxy, Russian language media. There is a need for international legal recognition of the new territorial realities that emerged with the incorporation of Crimea, Sevastopol, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions into Russia. The people there have determined their fate through a free expression of their will in a referendum. Ukraine itself must return to the origins of its statehood and follow the spirit and letter of the documents that created its legal basis. As a reminder, the provisions call for a neutral, non-aligned and nuclear-free status for the country, enshrined in the 1990 Declaration of its Sovereignty. In August 1991, the legislature adopted the Act of Proclamation of Independence of Ukraine, which reaffirmed the inviolability of the provisions in that constitution. The preamble of the current constitution of Ukraine has references to the Act of Proclamation of Independence. Well, that is an impossibly tall order. In fact, the demands here are so strong that I cannot imagine that the Russians seriously or generally believe that Ukraine is going to fulfill them. Not only is Ukraine not going to fulfill them, I am not sure that it can fulfill them. Consider, for example, the demand that there should be a withdrawal of all lawsuits against Russia and the return of all Russian assets that were illegally seized in the West. This provision, according to Lavrov, must be spelled out in a legally binding peace settlement agreement. Now, Ukraine has seized some Russian property on Ukrainian territory, but of course what Lavrov is referring to here are Russian property seized in the West, private property, presumably, owned by Russian business people and companies and individuals. But first and foremost, of course, the $300 billion or euros of frozen assets belonging to the Russian State Bank. And he refers to the lifting of anti-Russian actions, sanctions, and the return of its assets that were illegally seized in the West. Does that include the interest of those assets? I presume it does. Not only is it the West, first and foremost the European Union, that is in possession of these frozen assets, but as we know, they have been helping themselves to the interest and doing so to an increasing extent. And some Western governments have probably dipped deeper into the assets. They've gone beyond the interest itself. As my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou never ceases to point out, and does so correctly, by the way, the total amounts of money that the West has already subtracted from the frozen assets almost certainly is in excess of the interest, even the accrued interest, since 2022. I remember that only a few weeks ago, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was talking about further assistance to Ukraine, provided, paid for, not by the British taxpayer, but from Russian assets that were frozen, presumably in Britain. He said that in the House of Commons to applause and cheers from the British MPs. Well, Lavrov says that all of that must be returned, not just the capital, but as I believe, the interest as well. So it would mean that Western governments that have spent money, Russian money, on various Ukraine-associated things would have to come back to their taxpayers and say that in accordance with an agreement entered into between Ukraine and Russia, that money has to be paid back, and therefore taxes in Europe must be increased, or borrowing must be increased, or services must be cut, or something of that sort. I have to say, I cannot really imagine Western governments, European governments, willingly agreeing to this. And I don't see how Ukraine can agree with Russia to this on their behalf. These are, as I said already, impossible demands. Does that make them unreasonable demands? Well, of course, there's a good case for saying that demands which are impossible are also unreasonable. But is it really unreasonable for the Russians to ask for the return of the frozen assets of their central bank, covered by the doctrine of sovereign immunity? Arguably, those assets should never have been frozen in the first place. Arguably, it was a huge mistake and a major violation of international law to freeze those assets at all. Arguably, the Russians are in their rights to demand the return of those assets, especially in the event that there is a peace settlement between themselves and Ukraine, in effect ending the war. I personally cannot see upon what legal foundation European governments are going to be able to say, if there is a peace agreement of this kind between Russia and Ukraine, that they can hold on to the assets and refuse to pay them back, or pay any money they've taken out of those assets back to the Russians. And of course, this brings us back, therefore, to the perennial paradoxical question of why, despite the fact that Ukraine is now clearly losing the war, despite the fact that the West is in no position to help Ukraine win the war. Western governments, first and foremost European governments, are so resistant to any diplomatic initiative that might bring the war between Ukraine and Russia to an end. If they did that, if they came to an agreement on Russian terms, specifically on these Russian terms, it would cost them money which they might find it extremely difficult indeed to justify repaying to Russia, to their own taxpayers, at a time of European-wide budgetary crisis. Anyway, that's not, of course, the only terms that Putin and Lavrov and the Russians are demanding. They're demanding all the usual things that we've heard about many times. They want not just the sanctions lifted, as well as the repayment of the frozen assets. They want Ukraine to revert back to being a neutral, non-aligned country. They want Ukraine to recognize the four regions, the entirety of the four regions, as Russian. They want Ukraine to scale down its armed forces, to restore all rights that Russian citizens had, or Russian speakers rather had, in Ukraine, to restore in full the position of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. As to that, recently, in the last couple of days, the Ukrainian authorities have not only not complied with that Russian demand, they have stepped up their actions against the Russian Orthodox Church, or at least the Orthodox, the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine. It's technically not even Russian anymore. It does maintain a connection to the Patriarch of Moscow, but it is in most respects an independent church anyway. But even in spite of that, the Ukrainian authorities have now stripped the Metropolitan, the head of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, of Ukrainian citizenship, implying that he's really a Russian. And, well, we can see that instead of the Ukrainians doing the sort of things that Lavrov is saying they must do if there is going to be peace, then they're currently doing the diametric opposite. Not only is this all the case, but of course the Russians are now throwing back at the Ukrainians some of the statements and declarations they made back in 1990 and 1991 in the run-up to the collapse of the Soviet Union in terms of their own demands for independence, which they made at that time. So the Russians are now bringing up the declaration of sovereignty that Ukraine issued. The communist-led government of the then constituent republic of the Soviet Union, which was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Anyway, that is the 1990 Declaration of Sovereignty, which included a provision for Ukraine's neutrality, non-aligned and nuclear-free status. And the follow-up, August 1991 Act of Proclamation of Independence of Ukraine, which reaffirmed the inviolability of the provisions of the earlier 1990 declaration. Now, that must be, in some respects, a particularly embittering demand from the Russians, because, of course, these decisions, these foundational documents that Lavrov is returning to, were, when they were issued, anti-Soviet and, as many Ukrainians believed, anti-Russian. statements, declarations of Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union and, of course, ultimately from Russia. And at that time, the authorities in Moscow, who were, of course, the Soviet authorities in Moscow, were opposed to those declarations. But now Lavrov comes along. He says, well, after the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, we recognize the legality of these documents that Ukraine made at that time. Its declaration of sovereignty and its made in 1990, and its proclamation of independence, which it made in 1991. And the constitution, today's constitution of Ukraine, references these two earlier documents, specifically the Proclamation of Independence, which in turn references the Declaration of Sovereignty, and we therefore insist that these anti-Soviet, anti-Russian declarations be adhered to by Ukraine to the letter, thereby obliging Ukraine to accept its neutral, non-aligned and nuclear-free status. So as I said, this is in some ways throwing those documents back into the teeth of the Ukrainian nationalists or the Ukrainian national movement which authored them. Incidentally, on the topic of the Declaration of Sovereignty of 1990, note that in 1990, Ukraine's objective was to become neutral, non-aligned, and nuclear-free. Of course, it's become an unending, ceaseless trope repeated by Ukrainian officials constantly and all the time, repeated by Western commentators constantly and all the time, sometimes even accepted by Western governments and Western officials, including, by the way, and on several occasions now, the Trump administration, that Ukraine, when it became independent, was a nuclear power and that it made a massive mistake by giving up its nuclear weapons. I have repeatedly pointed out that this is wrong, that Ukraine never actually had nuclear weapons in its own lawful possession. The nuclear weapons that were located on Ukrainian territory were Soviet nuclear weapons, which, upon Ukraine's independence, passed to the control of the Russian Federation, to the Russian military, and which continued, therefore, to be controlled from Moscow. And here we have Lavrov reminding us that Ukraine itself at this time was acknowledging that fact because its own declaration of sovereignty of 1990 declared Ukraine neutral, non-aligned, and nuclear-free. Anyway, these are historical observations. They have some relevance, obviously, to the situation today, but I suspect that many Ukrainians, at least many Ukrainian officials, including all of the people of the nationalist movement, all of the people in the leadership of the Azov Brigade, and in the various other nationalist groups, and of course the Zelensky government, will be deeply, deeply angered by the way in which Lavrov is bringing up these documents. But the documents are there, they were made, they do exist, they do say, in essence, what Lavrov says, and, well, why wouldn't Lavrov, consummate diplomat that he is, backed by a foreign ministry that maintains massive archives and clearly has extremely capable lawyers why would he not bring up those documents and show them to the Ukrainians in future negotiations? Now, the one thing that Lavrov does not appear to mention in this interview, at least there's no reference to it in this summary provided by TASS, is the question of Ukraine's membership of the EU. But I've already been saying in various programs that, starting with certain comments made by Medvedev and which have been backed by Lavrov in earlier interviews and commentaries, and which have also been made by other Russian officials, including foreign ministry officials, it's clear to me that Ukraine's membership of the EU has now become a Russian red line. According to various reports, over the course of his telephone conversation with Donald Trump on Friday, Zelensky very reluctantly and unwillingly agreed to send his negotiators to meet again with Medinsky and the other Russian negotiators, presumably in Istanbul, sometime later this month. I expect that when that happens, not only will the Russians provide the text of this interview of Lavrov's, which has clearly been prepared with that meeting in mind, provide the text of that interview with Lavrov as a supplement to the memorandum that the Russians have already provided to the Ukrainians, setting out their terms. But they will also make clear to the Ukrainians that Ukraine's membership of the EU, as well as its membership of NATO, now cross Russian red lines and is therefore henceforth unacceptable. I suspect that the only reason Lavrov did not bring this up in this interview with the Hungarian media is because the Russians have not yet presented this to the Ukrainians, as they have obviously presented all of his other various demands. Now, on that topic, I ought to say that Lavrov perhaps doesn't need to spell out to the Hungarian media the fact that the Russians oppose Ukraine's EU membership, because Prime Minister Orban of Hungary and the Hungarian government have also made perfectly clear their own opposition to Ukraine's membership of the EU. They have collectively said that if Ukraine were to join the EU, it would bankrupt the entire organization and it would create a crisis in the agricultural sector with EU farm producers inevitably flooded by cheap Ukrainian agricultural goods. So maybe Lavrov also felt that there was no need for him to repeat the point to the Hungarians, because he knows that the Hungarians already oppose the whole idea of Ukraine's NATO entry. Well, these demands that the Russians are now making of Ukraine are so steep in aggregate that, to be frank, I simply cannot imagine, as I said, the current Ukrainian government accepting them. But coming to my earlier point about demands being exceptionally harsh and extremely tough, but perhaps not, properly speaking, unreasonable, it remains my view that Ukraine should tell the Russians that they're prepared to accede to the basic parameters of what the Russians are saying, and then maybe push back on some of these specific demands point out to the Russians that the question of the repayment to Russia of Russia's frozen reserves is simply not a matter within Ukraine's control, and that it is also not within Ukraine's control whether the Western governments do in the end agree to lift the sanctions they have imposed on Russia. Ukraine can negotiate with Russia for itself, but it cannot in the end negotiate on behalf of the United States, Britain, or the states of the European Union. Anyway, there it is. That's Lavrov's terms, Russia's terms. We see that the Russians are uncompromising. They're taking an ever harder position, and I suspect that they're going to go on doing so. And they do so from a position of ever-growing confidence. Now, in my program yesterday, I said that a strange story had circulated over the previous 24 hours, that the Russian offensive was somehow losing momentum, that there was no doubt at all that the Russians were hammering Ukraine every night now and every day now with hundreds of drones and scores of missiles, and nobody is suggesting that that is abating. Indeed, in fact, early this morning, there were more Russian drone attacks, specifically on the city of Kharkiv, drone and missile attacks. And I suspect that over the course of the day, we will be getting more drone and missile attacks across other regions of Ukraine. And perhaps there'll be a further big drone attack over the course of tonight. This now is gradually becoming, or maybe not gradually, rapidly becoming a nightly affair. The Western media is full of it. There is articles all over the British media about this today, talking about how Ukrainians now regularly lie in shelters, huddle in shelters, as the drones and the missiles pound Ukraine night after night. There's concern across the media about the effect that this is having on Ukrainian morale, especially following the admissions from Yuri Ignat that the Patriot missiles can't shoot down the missiles, and the information from the United States that it is no longer in a position to supply Ukraine with more Patriot missiles. So that drone and missile offensive continues, but nonetheless, there were suggestions over the last couple of days that the Russian offensive, the ground offensive, has in some way run out of steam. And I said in my program yesterday that I saw absolutely no evidence whatsoever that this was the case. And I noticed that there's been a shift in the mood again over the last 24 hours. And suddenly we're starting to get more acknowledgements of further Russian advances. Now, I'm not going to go into the great details about what is exactly happening on the battlefronts in this program. Suffice to say that the Russians, having pushed the Ukrainians further away from Tyotkino, that village in Kursk region, the Ukrainians no longer control, as far as I am aware, even a millimeter of territory in Kursk region. Anyway, the Russians have now crossed the border in other areas from Kursk region. They have captured another apparently important village not far from Totkino. They are expanding the areas of their control. Redovka has been saying for the last 2 days that the Battle of Yunakovka in Kharkiv region, in Sumy region, is over, that Yunakovka is under complete Russian control. I've not seen any other evidence that corroborates that, but then Redovka can be quite accurate is usually very accurate about these sort of claims. But anyway, there's been reports about this. There's been further reports about more Russian advances in the Liman area. Ukrainian attacks in the area of Redkobub, a village not far from Liman, have apparently been repelled. There are more reports of the Russians either having entered Siversk or fighting on the outskirts of Siversk. But perhaps more interesting, much more interesting, are reports that the Russians have indeed established themselves in Novoekonomichny, near to Pokrovsk. The Institute for the Study of War is now also talking about how the Russians are conducting an envelopment or encirclement of Pokrovsk itself. Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, Russian official, of course, as he now is, he has actually now given an interview to Russian television in which he said that the situation in Chasiv Yar is very good and we should expect good news soon, which I take to be a sign that Chasiv Yar has either fallen or is literally about to do so. I suspect that we're going to get confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry, maybe within a couple of hours, maybe in the next day or so, that Chasiv Yar indeed is completely under Russian control. Not just the central town, but all of the outlying micro-districts as well. Pushilin also said that following the fall of Chasiv Yar, he anticipated that the fall of Konstantinovka would follow quite quickly. Chasiv Yar, of course, is the high ground relative to Konstantinovka, and the Russians have surrounded Konstantinovka from three sides. Further north, and still in connection with all this fighting that's going on around Konstantinovka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and indeed even Pokrovsk, and corroborating further the claims by Radovka that there is heavy street fighting going on in Kupiansk and in the surrounding areas. We're getting further claims that the Russians have indeed captured a string of villages immediately to the west of Kupiansk, so that Kupiansk is ultimately surrounded. And of course, there continue to be Russian advances in western Donbass as the Russians push steadily, remorselessly towards the Dnieper. They captured yesterday an important village called Dubye, I'm probably getting the name wrong, and other villages here. In fact, talking about capturing villages understates the reality. What we're seeing in this area is an irresistible and increasingly rapid Russian advance towards the Dnieper, edging every day closer towards the city of Zaporozhye. And of course, since we're talking about the city of Zaporozhye, it does look as if the Russians not only have consolidated their control of Kamenska, village to the south of Zaporozhye, but they're now capturing territory beyond it, closer to the city of Zaporozhye itself. So, talk about the Russian military losing momentum doesn't seem to be true. In fact, I have no doubt at all that it is wrong. And we do see that the Russian offensive is continuing to grind on in its purposeful and methodical way. Now, over the last couple of hours, Simplicius the Thinker has also published a very interesting further update on his Substack blog. And this conveniently comes a short time after that utterly bizarre article in The Economist acknowledging the fact that the United States is levels of deindustrialization there are so severe that it will have to try and come up with some kind of strategy to rearm without reindustrializing. I've discussed that really strange article in, I think, the video that I made 2 days ago. Anyway, we've now had more news with more interesting information about developments on the Russian side. So first of all, let's start with Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General. Short time ago, he said that Russia produces more weapons in 3 months than the entire collective West does in a year. He's then said words which I have seen reported as saying that the Russians produce 3 times more ammunition in 3 months than the West does in a year. And that is actually extremely interesting because that would imply, think about it, that the Russians are producing more ammunition in 1 month than the collective West is producing in a year. Now, according to the reports, the United States is currently producing around 480,000 shells a year, 155 millimeter shells a year. I am not sure what the Europeans are producing, though I believe it is less than the United States, despite claims to the contrary. But let's be optimistic and say that it's slightly more. Perhaps the Russians, perhaps the Western powers are producing around 1 million shells over the course of a year, in which case, of course, the Russians, if you follow Mark Rutte's maths, must be producing 12 million shells a year. Now, I don't believe it is anything close to that number. Maybe Mark Rutte is getting his figures mixed up. I think that's more likely. Or perhaps he's adding shells produced by North Korea to the Russian total, though I don't myself think that the North Koreans can be producing that many shells. But anyway, put that aside, I believe that the Russians are producing between 3 and 4 million shells a year, and probably more around 4 million shells. I believe the North Koreans may be adding perhaps 1 million or more shells to that total. I've seen some claims that they could produce up to 9 million shells, but I think, again, that's probably overstating things. There is no doubt at all that the Russians are comprehensively outproducing the West in shells, and that the gap, if anything, has been increasing. But of course, it's not just increasing in terms of shells, it's increasing in terms of drones, as I've discussed in several programs. And as Simplicius the Thinker points out, it is increasing in terms of armoured vehicles as well. So Simplicius the Thinker has pointed out that Russia is producing around 300 T-90M tanks a year. Now, the figures, the articles that he's quoting, speak of between 250 and 300 T-90M tanks a year, but I've actually been told that it is, in fact, at least 300 of these tanks a year. These are completely new tanks, probably more. This is, of course, still well below what the Soviet Union was achieving in the 1970s and 1980s. But anyway, Russia is probably producing around 300 T-90Ms a year. Now, according to that article in The Economist, the United States is not manufacturing any new tanks at all. It is refurbishing its old M1 Abrams tanks and refurbishing one of these tanks apparently takes 2 years. The Economist says that in a crisis situation, the time to do that could be reduced, but disappointingly by not that much. And again, one can sense the problem, because if we're talking about new electronics, the very complex electronics that these tanks carry, for example, the fire control system and those kind of things, I get the sense that for each tank, these systems are now basically handmade. Probably that is also true in Russia, but by now the Russians have established production facilities to produce fire control systems, electronic-based fire control systems in quantity, and that doesn't seem to be the case with the United States. So the United States isn't producing any tanks. Britain isn't producing any tanks. I believe that Germany, in fact, despite some claims to the contrary, is also not producing any more Leopard 2 tanks. I am not sure what the situation is with tanks in France. Probably they're not producing Leclerc tanks either, but I'm not absolutely certain. Of course, 300 tanks that the Russians are producing, they're producing at least 5 times, or rather refurbishing at least 5 times that many old tanks. And apparently the production of tanks in Russia, new production of tanks, is likely to grow. The Russians have no shortage of tanks. They also continue to manufacture infantry fighting vehicles, tracked infantry fighting vehicles, the BMP-3, which is apparently a very highly rated infantry fighting vehicle. The Russians are somewhat unimpressed by the Bradley. They consider it to be the best of the various armoured vehicles, Western armoured vehicles, that they have encountered in Ukraine. They rate it more highly as an armoured vehicle than they rate the Western tanks they come up against. But I gather that the United States barely produces Bradleys anymore, or perhaps has stopped doing so entirely. Again, I'm not completely sure about this, but the Russians are indeed producing BMP-3s, apparently in significant numbers. In fact, as far as I can tell, the only area in which the United States has stable production in terms of conventional weapons is in fighter jets, where I believe the United States is producing around 3 F-35 fighter jets a week, around 150 a year, in other words. And that is a stable production rhythm. It's significantly higher than Russia, not higher than China. But then, of course, the United States has many, many more commitments for its Air Force than the Russians currently do. And gradually, from what I can also tell, Russian fighter jet production is gradually starting to creep up, though so far not close to achieving American levels. Just saying. Now, in Britain, the British have ended their role in producing Typhoon fighter jets. This is the European fighter jet that is produced by Britain, Germany, and Italy, and which forms the mainstay of the air forces of these three countries. Germany and Italy are continuing to play their role in producing Typhoon fighter jets, and are continuing to order more of them. The British, however, seem to have completely exited this game, at least according to the Financial Times they have. And apparently, to the annoyance of the Europeans, instead of focusing on production of the Typhoon fighter jet and looking forward towards further production of more advanced fighter jets by the European consortium that produces the Typhoon, the British have instead decided to buy F-35s from the United States. Though the batches of F-35s they are buying, by American standards, are very small, and they're also small by Russian standards also. So, fighter jet production still healthy in the United States, at least volumes. I'm not talking about the quality of the aircraft. I know that the F-35 has a certain reputation, but I'm not going to discuss that in this program. The state of production of fighter jets healthy in the United States, but apparently nowhere else, in no other part of the collective West either. So there it is. This is the situation that we are looking at today. There have been some small increases in production of some types of weapons. I gather that Caesar howitzers are now produced at the rate of one a year instead of one every 2 years or something like that. Well, again, I overstate things. I meant to say that it takes about 2 years to produce one of these howitzers, as opposed to just 1 year to produce one of these howitzers, as opposed to 2, as was the case before. But anyway, overall, we see, shall we say, massively disappointing outcomes in terms of weapons production across the collective West. Mark Rutte admits this. And, of course, only a part of what is left can be provided to Ukraine. And, in fact, over the last couple of weeks, I haven't heard of any major deliveries of weapon systems from any European country at all. Such deliveries as have been continuing to be made on any scale have been made by the United States. Apparently, France and Italy are now entirely out of Aspeed air defense interceptors, for example. Germany has at various times complained that it has no more Patriot systems to spare. I get the sense the Germans are pretty much exhausted whatever armoured vehicles they can send to Ukraine. To the extent that they send any, it's mostly Leopard 1 tanks from the 1950s and 1960s. And the Ukrainians say that these are not a match for the existing Russian tanks. And, well, I've discussed in many programs how there is now a crisis in the sky. Ukraine faces a crisis in the sky. The Russians are able to flood the skies both with the strategic Geran drones, which can also be used and are being used increasingly in tactical situations. And of course, they're now achieving a decisive advantage in FPV and other battlefield drones as well. Now, yesterday, I read somewhere a comparison of the personnel sizes of the two armies. And according to this claim, and I can't remember where it was, but it was in a Western outlet, the Russian forces in Ukraine, fighting in Ukraine, in the area of the special military operation, now number around 650,000, and the Ukrainian forces number around 400,000. So the Russians now outnumber the Ukrainians by a ratio of around 3 to 2. Now, in theory, if this was the Russian army was fighting this war like the Western army, that would mean that the Russians would have more than enough men and machines to spare to launch local counterattacks with an advantage of 3-1, sufficient, according to Western military philosophies, to achieve a breakthrough. And you can see sometimes that there is puzzlement and bafflement in the West that this is not what the Russians are doing. But the Russians have entirely different military doctrines, as I have discussed many times and in many places, right going all the way back to the First World War, to the period of the Brusilov offensive that took place in 1916. They've approached things in a different way. They don't seek localized offensives with breakthroughs along narrow fronts. They believe that trying to achieve such breakthroughs, ultimately self-defeating, the other side will eventually succeed in limiting the extent of the breakthrough. And what happens whenever breakthroughs like that are attempted is that the attacking force ultimately finds itself at risk of being surrounded and encircled as it digs deep into enemy controlled territory. At least I think I am summarizing the Russian perspective on this accurately. What the Russians do instead is that they gradually, steadily increase the pressure everywhere on the front lines, eventually causing a cascading collapse and a breakdown of the enemy's forces. And the Russian General Staff on the Russian Defense Ministry's Telegram channel actually mentioned that this was the strategy roughly a year ago, and I seem to remember that Group of Forces North said something similar, and we can see it play out in action. The Russians are not leaving any part of the front line static. They're attacking everywhere at once. They're putting growing pressure on the Ukrainians, forcing the Ukrainians to shuttle forces from one part of the front lines to another to prevent breakthroughs and breakdowns, and thereby increasing the pressure on the Ukrainians all the time. Now, I'm not, as I've discussed many times, a military expert. I'm not somebody who has deep knowledge of how to conduct war. I suspect that the Western system of breakthroughs on narrow fronts using combined arms tactics is completely obsolete today in modern war, where the drones can saturate the sky and giant minefields can be created. I still find from time to time exasperated articles. There was one a couple of months ago in the Daily Telegraph complaining about the fact that the Ukrainians are still not using Western combined arms tactics, which would cause them to achieve success in the war. This is an absurd hypothesis. The Ukrainians tried to use precisely such tactics during the summer 2023 offensive in Zaporozhye region. They failed completely. Again, I remember reading a report a while back, I think it was from the Royal United States Services Institute, which acknowledged that in fact it was wrong to say that the Ukrainians did not use Western strategies and tactics, or didn't attempt Western strategies and tactics over the course of the war. It was just that they found that they failed. Anyway, put that aside, and as I said, I'm not the best person, the best qualified person to comment about such things. It is not the Russian approach. They like to stretch out the front lines and keep the pressure, like increasing gradually pressure on an eggshell. The point will come when the egg itself will break. And that is what the Russians are doing. So anyway, over the last couple of hours, as I said, a Russian advance gaining further momentum, and we can see more data now. The data is piling up every day. The advantage, the military advantage, is passing further and further to the Russian side, and the Ukrainians are becoming outnumbered, both in men and in machines, including the drones. They have probably placed an undue degree of reliance upon. Now, having said all of this, it's perhaps worth saying that one of the other mistakes Westerners perhaps tend to make is assuming that the war is the all-absorbing topic in Russia itself. Now, as I said, I was recently in Russia. I was only there for a few days, attending a legal conference, a legal forum in St. Petersburg. And obviously, in the space of the short time I was there, it was not possible for me to judge the mood fully. But overall, I was surprised at how little emphasis was placed on the war within Russia itself. Maybe here I am being wrong, but my sense is that apart from the families of members, soldiers who are actually active on the front lines, the most important things for most Russians at this time is not the war itself, but the economy, their own situation, that of their families, and the general conditions of life in Russia. The war is always there in the background, but it is not as immediately important or as pressing as those other things. And that brings me to what I suspect is today the big news story in Russia. And I suspect it's going to be the big news story for the next couple of days. It is not the war or these advances that are taking place on the front lines, or Lavrov's statements about what Russia's terms to end the war are. It is the sudden dismissal of Russia's transport minister by President Putin and his replacement by a new transport minister. And then the revelation a few hours later that the minister who had just been sacked was found dead in his car, apparently by suicide. This bears all the hallmarks of a scandal, and it'll be very, very interesting to find out over the next couple of days what this scandal is all about and what its ramifications are going to be. But I suspect that over the next couple of days, this will be the big topic of conversation. Certainly at the highest levels of the Russian elite, and quite possibly within a certain section of wider society as well. Anyway, there it is. Now, even as all of these events are taking place, even as Lavrov is laying down the law on the eventual settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, assuming there is one, the BRICS summit meeting has been continuing in Brazil. The star the two stars have been Lula and Modi. As I've discussed, Putin and Xi Jinping are not there. I think Putin didn't go because of the very real risks to himself if he did, in light of the ICC warrant and the character of some of the Western governments that he needs to be careful about and their potential to intercept his plane. And I think the reason Xi Jinping didn't go, as I discussed in my previous program, is because Putin wasn't going. Xi Jinping does not want to go to Rio, to Brazil, without Putin. And just to add another further point, since Modi is in Brazil, and since Modi at the moment has grounds to be annoyed with China, because China supported Pakistan in the air clash that took place a few weeks ago, I can understand why Xi Jinping might feel that better stay away, participate in the meeting from a distance virtually, leave the hard work to Li Qian, the Chinese Prime Minister, rather than have potentially difficult conversations with Modi without Putin, who has, of course, good relations with both Modi and Xi, being there to act as a bridge between the two. So I think that there are explanations why Xi Jinping has stayed away, which probably have nothing to do with a political crisis in China, and certainly don't seem to me to be connected with problems in the BRICS. In fact, so far as I can see, the BRICS continues to develop. Lula being one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the new payment mechanisms. He's made certain harsh comments about the International Monetary Fund, for example, talking about how it has become old-fashioned and outdated. And my sense is that Lula has taken this all further. Meanwhile, BRICS has expanded. Vietnam and Indonesia have recently joined. There's been a spat between China and Vietnam. The Chinese were not happy with Vietnam's recent trade agreement with the United States, whereby Vietnam agreed to certain tariffs being placed on goods it exports to the United States. Those tariffs almost certainly affect Chinese goods which are exported to Vietnam and then re-exported to the United States, bypassing American tariffs on China. But it has been overlooked that the United States, apparently as part of the various deals that have been done between China and the United States, in London, the recent deals that have been done, the United States has started to relax some of its other export controls on goods sold by the United States to China. For example, I understand that the United States has scrapped its export controls on exports of aircraft engines to China. And those engines, therefore, are being exported again. Anyway, not only is the actual BRICS membership increasing, but what some are now referring to as the Greater BRICS is growing as well. The Greater BRICS is those countries that are not actually members of the BRICS as such, but which are aligning themselves increasingly to it, perhaps by joining certain of its institutions. And two countries, Uzbekistan and Colombia, have, for example, just joined the BRICS Bank. Now, I don't think that Uzbekistan's status is up to much discussion. Uzbekistan is a former Soviet republic in Central Asia. It has excellent relations with Russia. It has very close relations with China. It has reasonably civil relations with Iran, though apparently not perfect. But anyway, overall, it is a Eurasian state, and its membership eventually of the BRICS is probably a foregone conclusion, just saying. But Colombia is another matter again, because Colombia is a Latin American state which historically has been the single most reliable and consistently aligned with the United States of all of the Latin American states. Various Latin American states have at various times been very, very closely aligned with the United States, but sometimes they've distanced themselves from it, whereas Colombia, for pretty much all of modern history, since the building of the Panama Canal and all that, has been on very, very friendly terms with the United States indeed, at least at governmental level. Over the last couple of years, however, especially under the leadership of its current president, some distance has appeared, and Colombia now is joining the BRICS Bank. And I gather that another Latin American country, which is showing interest in the BRICS, though not currently aspiring for membership of the BRICS, is Mexico. In fact, they recently ruled out membership of the BRICS, saying it was incompatible with their current trade relations with the United States and the various agreements that they'd entered into with the United States, the North American trade area and all that. That country, of course, is Mexico. They apparently have also been taking an increasingly positive attitude to the BRICS, and I believe that their representatives were present in Brazil during this BRICS summit, though I'm not absolutely certain of this. Anyway, this is probably what has provoked a rather stiff comment on Truth Social by the US President Donald Trump. He has referred to BRICS as an entity hostile to the United States, and he has said that he will impose, without exception, 10% tariffs, additional tariffs, on any country that aligns itself with the anti-American policies of the BRICS. Now, this has already provoked strong negative reactions from the BRICS states, including the BRICS states that are represented in Brazil. And I should say China and Russia are both represented in Brazil. The Chinese by their Prime Minister Li Qian, the Russians by their Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Anyway, the BRICS states are pushing back. They don't like these threats from Donald Trump. Now, some, including parts of the British media, are treating Trump's comment as saying that any country that aligns itself with Russia will face 10% sanctions. But, of course, Russia is only one member of the BRICS, and Trump is clearly not thinking of Russia so much, but rather of the BRICS as a whole. I think Trump does understand, what many don't, that the BRICS, following its breakthrough summit meeting in October last year in Kazan, is indeed moving forward with various trade and payment mechanisms, and that these are developing actually quite rapidly, and that this is a challenge, perhaps a challenge more than a threat, to the existing trade and financial order created by the United States after the Second World War and dominated by the United States. So Trump is pushing back on that to some extent. But I suspect what has particularly incensed him is the fact that Colombia and Mexico are now showing an interest in this organization. And that is what has presumably provoked his comment. The BRICS are not going to pay any attention. They undoubtedly have come to think that what Trump is saying is mostly bluff. A few months ago, he also threatened tariffs against any country that aligned itself with the BRICS and which threatened the dollar, and nothing came of that. A few weeks ago, he said that any country that bought oil from Iran would be completely excluded from the American market. But about 10 days ago, he exempted China, Iran's biggest buyer of oil, from that restriction, if it even indeed applies. So I don't think that the BRICS are going to pay any attention to this latest threat. I don't think anybody else is going to do that. But again, Trump's comment does reflect perhaps a certain unease in the United States at the way in which BRICS continues to develop. Now, saying all of that, I don't myself think that the United States has anything to fear from BRICS. I think, on the contrary, if the United States looked to BRICS as a potential trade partner, it might actually work to the US's advantage. But anyway, that is not how Trump himself sees it. This meeting in Brazil, as I said, consolidates and builds on the work made in Kazan. I understand that the Chinese are now very well advanced in developing their own digital currency, and that it might start to operate functionally later this year. The Russians have postponed the full launch of their digital ruble until September of next year, but they've provided more details of what that launch will involve. And it is clear now that this plan to launch this digital ruble is becoming increasingly elaborated and mature and sophisticated. So I suspect that this meeting of the BRICS will be a further step in that direction. Just saying. Meanwhile, in Europe, things continue as always. In Britain, there is continued sense of crisis. There's a collapse, as people say, of fiscal headroom, because the government hasn't been able to save a couple of £1 billion by cutting the benefit budget, leaving Prime Minister Starmer's position in crisis, and that of his Chancellor still more so. I'm going to just make a few quick observations about this, by the way, which is that there is no honesty in Britain about this discussion. If you read the media, the right-wing media, the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, those sort of places, the whole problem is because supposedly of an out-of-control welfare budget. The welfare budget is indeed increasing, and one could argue that it is becoming an increasingly excessive burden on the British economy. It is also true, as many complain, that Britain is spending around £1.5 billion a year now, apparently on paying hostels to house incoming refugees. I've got that figure from the New Statesman, by the way. But large as that figure sounds, it's only a relatively small part of the British budget, even the welfare budget. And if you're talking about the whole British budget, it's a rounding out error. The reason there is a fiscal crisis in Britain goes back to 2008 and the financial crisis then. Before 2008, before the financial crisis, the debt to GDP ratio in Britain was around 36%. Then, after the financial crisis, in 2010, it had doubled to 70%. That is when the huge leap came, and when it became increasingly clear that the British government was becoming very heavily indebted and that its fiscal position was deteriorating and deteriorating sharply. And then, of course, we had a period of austerity under the Cameron-Osborne government, but that did not improve the situation overall. And by 2019, the debt to GDP ratio had worsened to 85%. And then the pandemic followed. And then, of course, as many people perhaps don't want to remember, in the first few weeks of the pandemic, there was another secondary bailout of the financial system, another bailout of the financial system, very similar to the one that took place in 2008, conducted by the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak. And I remember he was hailed as a genius for doing it. And that brought the debt to GDP ratio to around 90%, where it has remained ever since. In fact, gradually it has grown. There have been moments when it seemed to improve, but I believe it is now roughly at 96%. What basically happened in 2008 was that in order to bail out the banks, the British government, the banks in Britain, the British government transferred their bad debts onto the public account. In other words, bad private debts were transferred and became public debts. And the same thing happened in 2020 on a lesser scale during the pandemic. And, well, there have been various other subterranean bailouts as well, about which I know much less. That's the sort of area where Alex Craner and Tom Longer, they are much better at discussing those kind of things than I am. The surging welfare budget is a problem, but it would have been a containable problem if we had not had this underlying crisis as well. Now, this crisis of indebtedness is common to the whole of the West. The United States suffers from it. All of the European states suffer from it too. Britain perhaps is worse hit because in Britain the financial system, as a result of the Thatcher changes that took place in the 1980s, the financial system has became such a disproportionately big part of the British economy. And that meant that when the financial crisis hit home in 2008, Britain was particularly badly exposed. Not only has the debt to GDP ratio deteriorated in the way I've said, but productivity in Britain, which is very connected to the financial system, has in effect collapsed. Now, there are other contributing factors as well. You would have thought that given all of these problems, the British government, Western governments, would not want to pile on more problems on the economy. But of course they did so. They waged an economic war against Russia, which caused energy costs to explode. They continue to transfer funds to Ukraine at the rate of £5 billion a year, again deepening the fiscal crisis. They do all sorts of other things, and none of which, by the way, are openly discussed. Going back to that article I mentioned in the New Statesman, you will go through it and you will never find in any part of that article any reference to the problems left over from the bailouts, the disproportionate weight of the financial system within the British economy, the energy costs consequent upon the Ukraine crisis, the direct transfers to Ukraine. You'll not find any of that in that article. It talks about the need to raise taxes, but it doesn't explain why that need to raise taxes even exists. And it seems to me that until we finally start an honest conversation with ourselves in Britain and elsewhere in the West, both about how we got to this position that we are in today and what we are doing to make it worse. And I've been focusing on Britain. I've not discussed in this program the enormous problems that the European EU states, which are members of the Eurozone, have brought upon themselves by holding themselves inside this monetary straitjacket, which is the euro, which is having a catastrophic effect overall on the European economies. But until we have an honest conversation with ourselves and start looking at these problems and telling ourselves, how is it exactly that we got here? And what are we doing now, which is making it worse? And what can we stop doing, which might actually make it possible to start making things better? And what can we do beyond that, which will make it better still? Then things inevitably are going to go on getting worse. Our political class in Britain, in Europe, even to a certain extent in the United States, doesn't seem capable of doing any of those things. And the result is that in Britain, in Europe, we are in a deepening financial crisis, a slow motion financial crisis, which is also, of course, an economic crisis. Germany has its own set of problems. So does France. So does Italy. And instead of making these better, we persist in making them worse. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. This is, of course, an enormous topic that can be discussed more fully and thoroughly in other places. But, as I said, if we're going to find a way out, a little frankness and a little honesty with ourselves will at least be a start. And of that, for the moment, there is no sign. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.